Good morning. With this video, I'd like to continue to elaborate on ideas I have associated with my new energy declaration proposal. I am at this point wanting to recommend seriously the creation of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that would be a formal process that I imagine will take at least 2 to 3 years from this point to get organized, approved, and underway. I'm making this recording in October of 2013. When I first came up with the general ideas for this new energy declaration, it was in 2008, 5 years ago. I discussed it with several individuals conceptually, and some of them were quite interested in the ideas and thought they made sense. Others were skeptical. 3 years ago, when I first put this petition campaign into a formal written format, my emphasis was on calling for a presidential executive order to declassify needed revolutionary energy technologies impounded under the 1951 Invention Secrecy Act, which is a topic that the general public still today in 2013 knows very little about, and it's a very important topic. However, from the beginning, it wasn't clear to me and to several others that I discussed these concepts with just exactly what we would be calling for in terms of declassification and release of technologies and other details associated with this proposal. From the beginning, people were very skeptical that anyone in the president's office in the United States, given our current political processes, would sign the kind of executive order that was being requested. And at the same time, as I just mentioned, there were questions as to the phrasing of what would be called for, because there are certain technologies that have been locked down under Section 181 of the 1951 Invention Secrecy Act, which no doubt should be kept from open distribution in the world, simply because a number of those technologies might very well have serious security issues and so forth. However, we are convinced, based on whistleblower testimony from behind the scenes, a number of academic researchers who have looked into this issue of the 5,000 plus patents locked down under the 1951 Invention Secrecy Act via the PTO Security Group panel, etc., have concluded that there are probably several hundred of those remarkable inventions that represent commercially viable energy technologies, a percentage of which would have applications for the transportation fleet of our world, that could be released without any significant additional threats, dangers to our world stability. And certainly those of us who have researched these issues and looked into them conclude that the overwhelming reason that those secrecy provisions have been applied in this general area of technology have to do with financial and political status quo dynamics and actors, and wanting to keep those in place. And this is an area that's very problematic, because it runs against founding principles of our nation in terms of government accountability, transparency, the ability of we the people to know what our government is doing in our name and to reasonably participate in major decisions. And secondly, it's an activity that has gone very much against the welfare of the people of our nation and our standards of living and our personal freedoms, our quality of life, and the quality of life for people around the world. It is an issue that has exacerbated international tensions dramatically, and this associates with competition over limited fossil fuel resources, driving our military policy to protect energy corridors and this sort of thing, all needless. But we the people don't even know about this issue because it's being kept secret from us. So I want to say that as the last 3 years have transpired since I first put the New Energy Declaration in written form, got about a half a dozen people to sign it at my request as initial signatories, then took it offline, feeling that the time was premature to circulate it. I have moved in the direction of emphasizing these Truth and Reconciliation panel concepts. I do not want to propose, I'm not proposing something that could go the way of the 9/11 Commission or the Warren Commission that looked into the JFK assassination, because both of those processes did not come up with good results, because they were again allowed to be controlled by factions and individuals who had conflicts of interest with regard to the subject matter being investigated. So we need something much more open than that. With the internet today, we can achieve that. And with the kind of honest and sincere people, knowledgeable people in this area that I am in contact with, that associates with groups like the New Energy Movement and Sterling Allen's New Energy Congress circles, the Thrive Movement, the Breakthrough Energy Movement Group, Dr. Greer's networks, and others, we can bring together individuals who have been working as good-hearted volunteers in these areas for in the range of 5 to 10 years and more, who are aware of the issues, who are knowledgeable, balanced people with common sense, and people that the public can trust to be involved in reviewing the energy and transportation technologies that have been locked down for decades under Section 181, along with counterparts from the formal structures. And this will involve individuals associated with the security group panel of the PTO. They will be people from the CIA. They will be people from associated with the Pentagon. In what capacity, hard to say. Some, probably at least one on the executive staff of the White House, and others who from the Department of Energy, from PTO, etc., who have been involved in the formal lockdown of these technologies in certain cases. Our group of an informal volunteers network who's been collaborating on these topics and sharing information for 10 or so years understands that the majority of promising technologies, breakthrough technologies, paradigm-busting technologies that would offer major improvements to the energy and transportation sector, these huge problematic sectors of the global economy, allowing us to have off-grid power for residences and commercial establishments way beyond photovoltaics in terms of the price benefit equations and etc., allowing vehicles to run from water or be recharged as electric vehicles, again from off-grid free energy technologies, quote-unquote free energy, not involving purchased fuel, and quantum improvements over existing sustainable technologies. We know that the majority of these technologies that have created major buzz for going back to 100 years in the past, especially the last 50 years, have bit the dust for a wide combination of reasons not involving the application of Section 181. They have involved the black shelving dynamic that is the buyout of technologies and then keeping them off the markets. But many of these cases that involve the investors who become problematic and start filing lawsuits against the would-be household name inventor who has come up with one of these amazing technologies. We've documented so many different varieties where there have been commercially viable prototypes that have mysteriously not made it to market. But in some cases, what appears to be a standard greed dynamic, an inventor in conflict with an investor, we, on further investigation, find out that the investor has a very shady background and has been doing very unethical things that have been documented by the inventor, including threats that should invoke law enforcement, the involvement of the FBI, for example, local law enforcement backed by the FBI, if needed, backed by federal marshals and so forth. and instead law enforcement does not come to the avail of this individual. The individual ends up in federal court facing this investor who has done certain squirrely and things in the relationship with the inventor that should get him in trouble with the court system, but miraculously and very disappointingly, the federal court rules against the inventor. There's a lot of these cases, and what I'm getting at is that we know there are setups, whether the setup comes from the private energy sector, the major oil firms, for example, or these major utility companies, which even at the local level are often conglomerated into regional major firms in the energy sector, and then they in turn are held by high financial interests associated with Wall Street and the City of London. They trace back to groups like Citibank, Barclays, Deutsche Bank, Goldman Sachs, and so forth. So whether the problematic dynamics, lack of law enforcement, lack of court rulings following basic constitutional and common law principles comes from something out of the private sector or associates formally with, for example, a Section 181 order. In both cases, there is a lack of needed appropriate law enforcement involvement, and there is an issue of the judicial system, which is what stands behind law enforcement. Law enforcement, after all, is enforcing laws. The interpretation of laws and the creation of new laws is the court system, right? It goes back to the Department of Justice. It associates with our federal courts. And we have a problem there too, because there's a long history of something that just comes to mind right now is the Paul Pantone case, for example. And many have written about this issue of federal courts with a gold fringe around their flags, and the federal courts admitting in certain cases, and judges admitting in certain cases, that they're operating under admiralty law, which is quite inappropriate for a federal court. They're supposed to be operating under constitutional law. And Mr. So-and-so, sorry, but you don't have those rights in my courtroom. My courtroom is operating under this contract and an admiralty law interpretation and so forth. And, you know, gosh, well, okay, so I end up in prison then for reasons that do not make any sense according to constitutional or common law. These kinds of things become so complex and so confusing and so frustrating and so, I mean, depressing, really, for those of us who are in this new energy, breakthrough energy movement area to try to deal with, because on one hand, there's a significant element of our community that says we need more incubators, we need more money for R&D, and we need more money for protection of inventors and promising inventions and small companies and so forth. All of that is generally recognized. There's a growing recognition and there's a growing acknowledgement of this area that I have been just sort of instinctively focused on for 10 years since I got involved in this whole area via my acquaintance meeting Dr. Brian O'Leary in January of 2004 and getting involved with things subsequently. I have instinctively been attracted to this area of the suppression story and the lack of fidelity to constitutional law principles. Our Pentagon and CIA and FBI, not the court system nor law enforcement, and the Pentagon gets involved through this security group panel at PTO and other dynamics, Section 181, not following constitutional law principles. And I have constantly been saying to the New Energy Movement group, circles I've been associated with for 10 years, in communication with, to other individuals that I have been periodically in communication with on these topics, and the Thrive Movement Network and others. Time out. We need to address this issue that's very problematic and it's intimidating and it's obviously not going to be a pushover that the highest levels of our court system, all the way up to the Supreme Court and the Department of Justice, are not following core constitutional principles in this case. When you have someone serving a Section 181 order to someone like Stan Myers, who's learned how to run an internal combustion engine from water, and they're showing up from the Pentagon and they're invoking the 1951 Invention Secrecy Act and saying we need to impound this. And he says, hey, well, my attorney says we're not liable subject to that because I've disclosed it to this party already and so forth, and then a month later he's dead. These things cannot be considered coincidences. We need to look into this. In other cases we've documented of inventors being served with Section 181, it is not a legitimate national security threat involved. We the people, the mainstream media, the general public is none the wiser for this miraculous technology that would make all our lives better, to power our homes off grid, to power commercial residences anywhere, to power agriculture and pumping of water out in the desert areas or wherever in completely new ways, currently not feasible, to power our vehicles in ways off grid with electricity or running water through advanced electrolysis and all this kind of stuff. This is not, many of these cases, the majority, do not involve legitimate national security concerns. They're abuses of constitutional principles. They're abuses of invocations of national security law, etc. This needs to be addressed. And then when the FBI comes in and tells local law enforcement to stand aside, you're not to be providing protection for this small inventor and so on and so forth. We've been contacted by the US Marshals. They've been contacted by the CIA. They've been contacted by the security group of the PTO, and this trumps us on the organogram. So, Mr. Sheriff, you need to stand aside. These kinds of issues have to be put front and center and actually given higher priority than the main focus we have somewhat understandably been honoring and giving concentration to in the last 10 years or so within the new energy circles and networks I've been associated with, of more money for R&D, more money for incubation and all that, but it's going to hatch more eggs, and a percentage of them will be these magnificent golden eggs of a type that has periodically surfaced naturally from the substratum, in some cases as a result of taxpayer-funded activities occurring behind the scenes in the skunk works, of the black budgets, the R&D sector, the energy sector itself and its R&D mechanisms, from just the general, entrepreneurial culture of the United States and elsewhere around the world. And there's a counterpart international dynamic involved in this whole story of suppression. But then when we get not just an egg, but a really promising golden egg, the snake slithers out from the background, swallows it, and disappears. And we're going to pretend like what's needed is more golden eggs. Again, there's a general recognition now, and it's been growing in the 10 years that I have been involved with this cause as a volunteer, that we need really bulletproof protection in these areas. Dr. Stephen Greer was saying it, to his credit, openly 10 years ago. I was watching his videos on this topic 10 years ago, literally, after getting involved in this area, and he was saying it back then, shortly after the disclosure project conferences that were held more than 10 years ago. But it's been, and even there, but that story needs to be filled out. It needs to be a very comprehensive, focused, long-running campaign that continues to gather momentum a year at a time until finally the force of water behind that dike wall is such that all of the elements, the corrupt elements at high levels in the formal governance structures of our nation, the United States, and these problematic private sector, very powerful secret government type groups that in turn control the regulation mechanisms and the decisions made at high levels. We know this is a common phenomenon, whether we're talking about the SEC, or we're talking about the Pentagon and the DOD, or we're talking about the FDA, or we're talking about the Department of Energy or other groups, we know that we got a very problematic dynamic in our governance structures at this point with the corruption of the capture, the regulator, revolving door. This has to be addressed. And in this area of our world needing so desperately these revolutionary, advanced, clean energy and transportation technologies that have been withheld by more ad hoc and more accidental or more systematic means for 50 to 100 years, and very systematically in the last 50 to 60 years, we need to address this elephant in the room, or maybe the better metaphor is the snake that keeps coming out and swallowing the golden eggs and going back into the bushes, and the public knows nothing about it. The media will not talk about it to the extent they know anything about it. There's a multi-year campaign needed in this area. But there has to be specific proposals associated with it. So one of the big challenges I've had as an individual, as one person in our world wanting to make a contribution in this area, is talking to influential people behind the scenes for years on this topic, as I have been doing, having difficulty coming together with a concise game plan that can become a petition with media around it, with ongoing interviews and media resources and outreach efforts, educational efforts. There has to be some kind of a specific formula to gather support around, to gather momentum around. And I think that this idea of a formal truth and reconciliation process is appropriate and should go forward. And what I have in mind at this point, just as a rough sketch proposal, which can change in its details in the months and years to come, would be a 21-member commission with 11 of us, if you will, and 10 of them. 10 individuals who have been involved in the formal structure suppressing this, the emergence of these technologies, and such individuals do exist, and 11 who would be nominated by me and a group of peers, and I've already put forward privately behind the scenes a half dozen names to a half dozen different individuals. I don't think it'll be hard to come up with a group that the public is willing to endorse and say, yeah, and I would personally want to be involved with that panel as well. And the public would be willing to say, yes, we want you, 11 people, involved, and we're willing to trust your judgment on the other 10. What would be the assurance that this kind of thing, commission, and the panel would then have to review all these patents that are locked down and discuss a lot of other issues that associate with federal court rulings, Supreme Court rulings, the activities of the FBI and the CIA and the US Marshals and their collaboration with sheriffs. We need private investigators involved. We would also rely upon the services of certain federal investigators, but we would be double checking everything. We would be doing forensic accounting. We would have forensic accountants involved with this. We need to look into the history of cases like the Paul Pantone case and many others where we want more details about exactly what went on here. This panel then, this Truth and Reconciliation panel, would be publishing things on the internet, I would presume daily. And how the details of this will work, I don't know at this point. But that daily publication would come through a principal website. It would then be syndicated out. And there would be feedback mechanisms from the general public. There would be spam filtering. People might have to register to place their comments. There would have to be approvals on that. It's not going to be a total, shootout, Wild West style. But it is going to be as open as possible of a process to bring us back somewhat in, to the degree possible, in alignment with founding principles of constitutional law, Bill of Rights principles, principles of transparency in government, accountability in government, a government of, by, and for the people, etc. We will only condone national security lockdowns of technologies and blackouts of information, as has been the case in so many cases in this area, we know, for 50 plus years, where it is a legitimate added weapons potential sort of a thing. We know of many, many cases where these most dangerous technologies are in use today around the world already. And it's Tesla's death ray, but it's being used up in the HARP arrays in the North Pole, and we don't know exactly what's being done with control of weather and other problematic applications of that ELF type technology. So we already have had the phenomenon of the most dangerous technologies being used in underground bases around the world. You know, ongoing detonations and testing of nuclear weapons out in Pacific atolls and shoulder-mounted heat-seeking missiles. All this kind of stuff's already out there. We're not buying into this panel will not be buying into condoning rubber stamping anything that is a direct abuse of national security provisions, and we know this has been often the case. And where it is really, well, look guys, the people behind the scenes who've been doing this, top people in the CIA who are responsible for global energy security, et cetera, et cetera. Well, Jim, you know, Joel Foster, Sterling, whoever may be involved with this panel, look guys, here's how we have to do this. Look at the revenues that is coming right now from the gas pumps around the world. In our country, let's focus just on our country. And out of a $5, let's make it simple, gallon of gas, $1 plus is going to support federal and state infrastructure through taxes and so forth. If that got cut off right away, and if you come out with an accelerated program that you're proposing to get out these paradigm improving, let's say it appropriately, technologies in this area and that area and that area, because we need them in the residential area, we need them in the commercial area, we need them in the transportation area yesterday, soon. So I'm going to be advocating that. They need to get out now. Then it could cause an upset to the financial markets, the stock market. Why? We need to plow through all this stuff. I've got a master's degree in international affairs. Aren't you impressed? I can pull that out of my back pocket. But I can go, our panel is going to be designed to go up against all this nonsense, excuse making of the reasons why our world can't improve. That's what it amounts to. Guys, our world can't improve. They're not going to say it that way. They're going to be like, these will be major changes. Cross out the word changes and substitute the word improvements. And we'll say, yes, you're right. And here's all the ways we can address it. The concern is always major disruption. Our major disruptions are coming anyway, but they've been threatening to go the water world scenario. It's really at the 11th hour, the 11th, you know, the 59th minute of the 11th hour, we need to get these major improvements underway. And clearly we need people who think more like me and the kind of people that I network with on these issues, who are the can-do type people, who are not afraid of things, who are not so bought out to the status quo powers and so worried about their pension and their investment portfolio, or who may come from the high levels of the Illuminati structure and whack them around, that they're like a deer in the headlights even if they want to help. They just need to be pushed to the sidelines by those of us who say, we know how to do this. We need to get a clear channel out to the public. The public needs to get behind us and empower us, and we're going to make it happen. It's time to improve the world. It's long overdue. It all should have happened yesterday, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Back in the Carter era of the 1970s Iran crisis and long lines at the gas stations was when Stan Myers was trying to get out the dune buggy that runs on water, internal combustion engine. And Pentagon comes down, protecting us, we the people, while increasing the national debt and deficits at the most incredible rate ever since. You see, this is all wrong and it needs to be addressed. So more money for R&D to get these technologies out, and the campus where the new energy inventors can network, and some protection for that is second priority. It's important. We need to do that too. First priority is we have to stop the snake from coming out and swallowing all these golden eggs, and we need to get it to regurgitate, and we can clean them up, disgorge things that are already in this Section 181 portfolio and elsewhere on the black shelves in a warehouse somewhere in Ohio, in a warehouse somewhere in Abu Dhabi and so forth, that our forensic accountants and our private investigators associated with this TR panel will find. And they're already ready to go. They don't need any R&D. The protection will be part of this whole plan of accelerated distribution of these technologies on a global basis. And the TNR process and its findings is going to shame people. It's going to shame major corporations and bureaucracies that have been involved in this agenda. And there needs to be a concept of restorative justice within that. And as part of all this, there will be there can be a compulsory component to this that develops as things get going, and there probably should be. There probably should be some class action lawsuits. The court system, the federal court system, and the Supreme Court is going to get shamed into greater compliance with the constitutional principles and constitutional law as this unfolds. It's guaranteed to happen. So they're going to be held to accountability through this daily and ongoing publication through the main website for this panel and so forth, into falling back into closer alignment with founding principles of our nation. And then there can be, as I say, certain lawsuits, possibly, I don't know, grand jury processes, etc. But I think that initially, and maybe the majority of the subsidization and support for an accelerated program of getting these improperly long withheld technologies out to the United States population and internationally can occur voluntarily when it becomes clearer to the public and documented and indisputable with related investigative background and forensic accounting documents published on the internet and so forth, that this party and that party and this company and that company have benefited to the extent of billions and tens of billions, and who knows, dramatically benefited financially and in terms of revenues and market share and all this through activities that were fundamentally illegal, unlawful, unconstitutional, unethical. In some cases, they're going to hit all those bases, and this can all work together. This is not a plan oriented towards punitive anything, including no punitive damages. Punitive damages do not need to be involved at all, believe me. If you could get your arms around compensatory damages in this area, it would be so staggering that the mind reels. You know, they just, I don't know how you could possibly, how that could possibly be sourced. I'm not even proposing that. Full compensatory damages with all the things that have gone sideways here, and not to make this into too big of a story, would just be it's much greater than our needs. We wouldn't be able to digest that amount of money through a process even of accelerated global distribution of these technologies in the next 5+ years. But a partial element of that an integration of that compensatory damage concept can and should fly under the banner of restorative justice. Capital R, capital J, restorative justice. And this is a principle of natural law. This is fundamental to our genetics and to our human nature. It's just a concept of like, time out, guys, this is really unfair and wrong. It needs to be addressed. Realize that when our country was founded, through the process of the Declaration of Independence, the decision to make a break with the government of England and what was going on there with the British East India Company and all of that, the Boston Tea Party and all of the things that were fomenting at that time, proceeding into the Constitution, the ratification of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, its ratification, and all of that, was a principle of natural law. It was, the government is created by the natural sovereigns. Who are the natural sovereigns? It's we the people. Read the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. It's all right there. The government in our world today, 2013, in the United States, has become this thing where I watch a Dick Cheney or a Condoleezza Rice or a Donald Rumsfeld or somebody else with a little American flag on their lapel saying they're at the UN forum, or they're in front of cameras and the mainstream media, all this, and the United States is outraged about when the United States has decided to, and the headlines are, the United States has done this, and the United States is, and I'm like, nobody consulted me. I'm part of the we the people. I have really good education in these areas. I'm in my 50s. I spent a whole life studying things much more than most of these talking heads that are in high positions in government with a little flag on their lapel. Who consulted me about this, including my representatives in Congress, continue to do things that I think are total idiocy and against founding principles and unlawful. They're not constitutional at all. And they're letting all these things ride that are unconstitutional executive orders. And they're not looking into things that need to be looked into that I care about deeply. And they don't respond to letters I've sent them and so forth. Do you see what I'm saying? The natural sovereigns who created this thing in the first place, it's become kind of a Frankenstein, our federal government dragging chains down the hall at midnight, were the natural sovereigns, we the people. It is only human beings that have this natural sovereignty that they can then lend to the structure of a government. But when that structure of government no longer follows the founding principles at all, blatantly doesn't follow the principles that the sovereigns, the natural sovereigns, created, it's time for us, we the people, to say, time out. So this is what this new energy declaration is all about.